The city above slept in its usual indifference, oblivious to the rot festering beneath its cobblestone arteries. Rain fell on Vienna in slow gray sheets, the kind of rain that softened footsteps and swallowed gunfire before it could echo too far. Chris Redfield crouched on the rooftop of an abandoned chemical plant on the eastern edge of the old industrial district, his breath measured, his rifle resting against the iron railing like an extension of his own arm. Below him, 3 unmarked vans idled near a service hatch that, according to the intel, led directly into a black site no government had ever admitted to building. The briefing had been short, too short. A private security firm, well-financed and dangerously discreet, had been moving human test subjects through this district for months. Disappearances, blood work anomalies, rumors of a new strain of viral mutagen that did not match anything in the BSA archive. Chris had heard variations of that story across 3 continents. He had buried friends because of those stories, so when the call came, he did not hesitate. He assembled a 6-man team, requisitioned suppressed weapons and thermal optics, and flew in under a false manifest. Another mission, another lab, another reminder that the world never really learned. His earpiece crackled. Ray's confirmed eyes on the western approach. Vargas reported the sewer line clear. The hatch opened with a hydraulic hiss, and Chris descended the rusted ladder into a corridor that smelled of mildew and antiseptic. That particular cocktail he had come to associate with bioweapon research the way other men associated coffee with morning. The walls were concrete, recently poured. The lights flickered with a rhythm that suggested an old generator working too hard. He moved forward in tight formation, hand signals replacing voices. Every door cleared with the choreography of men who had done this 100 times before. What they found in the 3rd chamber stopped them cold. It was not a laboratory. Not in the traditional sense. There were no incubation tanks, no centrifuges, no plasma coolers humming in sterile silence. Instead, there were chains. Heavy iron chains bolted to the walls, blackened with old blood. There were cages, but the bars had been bent outward, as if whatever they once held had decided to leave on its own terms. And there were bodies, mercenaries in tactical gear, throats torn open in ways no human teeth could have managed. Scientists in lab coats, their chests caved inward as though crushed by something enormous and patient. Chris had seen tyrants. He had seen lickers. He had walked through corridors filled with the remains of men whose final expressions had been stitched into eternity by sheer terror. But this was different. The wounds here were old in some places and impossibly fresh in others, as if the violence had unfolded over centuries rather than minutes. Then the screaming began. It came from the level below them, a guttural, animal sound that shifted halfway through into something almost human, almost mournful. Raised his weapon. Vargas swore quietly in Spanish. Chris simply listened, cataloging, calculating, the way he had learned to do in Africa, in Eastern Europe, in every shadowed corner where corporations had decided that life was a commodity to be redesigned. The first creature came up the stairwell at a speed that made physics feel optional. It was tall and lean, its skin pale to the point of translucence, its eyes burning a dull crimson. The second came behind it on 4 legs, fur-matted, jaws unhinged, its body a contradiction of human shoulders and lupine musculature. They did not coordinate. They tore at each other even as they tore through his team. Rays went down first. Chris did not freeze. Freezing was for civilians and rookies and men who believed monsters were rare. He emptied a magazine into the pale one and watched it stagger, wounded but not stopped. He drew his sidearm and put 2 rounds through the second creature's eye, and it recoiled with a shriek that rattled the concrete. He retreated. He regrouped. He survived. By the time he reached the surface, his team was gone, his radio was dead, and his understanding of the world had just been quietly and permanently revised. He stood in the rain for a long moment, blood not entirely his own dripping from his sleeve, and he did what soldiers like Chris Redfield always did when confronted with a new battlefield. He began to study it. The hotel room was nothing special. A safe house 2 districts away, paid for in untraceable currency, lit by a single desk lamp that threw long shadows across the walls. Chris had stripped his gear and laid it out in precise rows on the bed. The sidearm, the combat knife, the empty magazines. He sat in front of them and did not move for nearly an hour, the way some men sit before an altar. Then he opened his notebook and began to write. He started with what he had seen. The pale one moved at speeds approaching 40 kilometers per hour in short bursts. Its skin resisted standard rounds but did not deflect them entirely. The wounds had not closed during the engagement, which meant regeneration was not instantaneous. The four-legged one had been more resilient against bullets but more vulnerable to direct impact trauma. Its bite force had crushed Vargas's chest plate, but its joints had locked momentarily when it pivoted at high speed. These were not viruses. These were not tyrants. These were something older, something biological in a way that broke the rules he had memorized. And yet biology was still biology. Even Nemesis had bled. Even Wesker had fallen. He spent the next 3 weeks vanishing into the city's underbelly. He bought silver from a jeweler who asked no questions and reforged it himself in a rented machine shop, casting hollow point rounds with cores designed to fragment on impact. He acquired ultraviolet flares from a military surplus contact in Prague, then modified them into shoulder-launched concussion devices that flooded enclosed spaces with searing light. He mapped the city's forgotten infrastructure, the abandoned subway lines, the sealed maintenance tunnels, the cathedral crypts that municipal planners had quietly forgotten to demolish. And then he began to hunt. The first cell he eliminated was a vampire safe house beneath an old brewery near the river. He did not breach the front. He waited until just past dawn, when their reflexes would be at their slowest, and he flooded the lower chambers with ultraviolet light before any of them could rise. He moved through the smoke with the calm of a man inspecting machinery, double-tapping each form he found, never wasting a round, never lingering. The next was a Lycan den in a defunct rail yard. He poisoned the ventilation with a chemical agent designed to disrupt canine olfactory receptors, then triggered a controlled collapse of the structure's eastern wall, funneling them into a single corridor where his silver rounds did the rest. He did not shout. He did not gloat. He simply finished his work and walked away before anyone above ground noticed the smoke. To the immortals of the Underworld, this was unprecedented. They had survived centuries of human ignorance. They had outlived empires and inquisitions and witch hunts. Humans, in their experience, came at them with torches and prayer and stumbled blindly into ambushes prepared centuries in advance. Humans were prey, occasionally inconvenient, never strategic. But this one was different. This one studied them. This one adapted faster than their oldest hunters. This one did not believe in their mythology, did not fear their bloodlines, did not hesitate when their eyes flashed crimson or their jaws unhinged. This one treated them like an outbreak to be contained, and that, more than any silver bullet, was what made him terrifying. Whispers began to circulate through vampire covens from Budapest to Berlin. A ghost was walking the tunnels, a soldier without faction, without sponsor, without fear. Some called him a relic of an old order, perhaps a survivor of a forgotten cleric purge. Others insisted he was an experiment of their own kind, slipped loose from a hidden cell. None of them guessed the truth, because the truth was simpler and more insulting than any of their theories. He was just a man who had walked into hell so many times that one more circle of it had not impressed him. A man who had buried too many friends to be moved by the novelty of new monsters. A man whose patience had been forged in laboratories that made the underworld look almost quaint. And he was only getting started. Celine had hunted Lycans since before the modern world learned to write its own history. She had killed cleric assassins, betrayed her own elders, and walked out of fires that should have consumed her a dozen times over. She had stood across battlefields from men in armored exosuits and from creatures with the strength of demigods, and she had always understood the architecture of combat the way a violinist understands her instrument. So when the Coven elders summoned her and told her that a single human was dismantling their European operations, she did not laugh, because Celine did not laugh, but she did allow herself the smallest measure of disbelief. One human. They wanted her to bring him in, or if he resisted, end him. She agreed because she always agreed. She tracked him because tracking was what she did. She found his patterns, the way he favored pre-dawn strikes, the way he never used the same egress route twice, the way he left his kill sites cleaner than most professionals left their kitchens. By the third week she had a profile. Military training, almost certainly Western special operations, but with something extra layered over it. A familiarity with biological horror. A precision that suggested not just experience but doctrine. She set her trap in an abandoned subway station beneath the 8th District, a place she had used to break men before. She knew every sight line, every blind corner, every collapsed maintenance shaft. She brought 2 of her best, positioned them in elevated nests, and waited in the dark with the patience of something that had practiced patience for 600 years. He walked in 12 minutes after her predicted window. He did not walk down the main corridor. He came from the maintenance shaft she had assumed was sealed. He took out her first spotter with a single suppressed round before either of them had registered his presence, then disappeared into the shadows before her second spotter could acquire him. Celine heard a brief, wet sound from the eastern platform, and then silence, and then she was alone with him in a tunnel she had thought belonged to her. When she finally saw him, framed in the green glow of an old emergency light, she understood. He was broader than she had expected, built like a man who had survived not by speed but by refusal. He carried his rifle the way she carried her pistols, as if it had grown there. He did not posture. He did not threaten. He simply assessed. The fight that followed lasted 9 minutes. By Underworld standards, this was an eternity. She closed the distance in a heartbeat, and he absorbed her opening strike against a forearm guard she had not noticed in the dim light, the impact ringing through reinforced ceramic plating. She fired twice into his vest, and he answered with a flashbang she had not seen him prime. She moved through the brightness, faster than the device could compromise her. But when she reached the space where he should have been, he was already 3 meters left, drawing a knife coated in something that smelled faintly of garlic distillate and silver nitrate. They traded ground through 3 platforms. He never tried to win in a single exchange. He won small pieces of terrain, small fragments of advantage, the way a chess player wins, the way a siege engineer wins. He bled. She bled. Neither of them retreated, but neither of them committed to the killing blow, because both of them, somewhere in the back of the animal mind that combat lives in, recognized the other as something rare. When the fight ended, it ended by accident. A support beam collapsed under a stray round, separating them, sending dust and debris between the platforms. By the time the air cleared, he was gone, and she was bleeding from 3 places she could not remember being hit. She returned to the Coven and did not file the report they expected. She told them she had encountered the target. She told them he was dangerous. She did not tell them that she had recognized, in the green glow of that old emergency light, something she had not seen in a human in centuries. She had recognized a worthy opponent. The data drive he had pulled from a dead vampire's coat sat on the desk in his safe house for 2 days before he could decrypt it. When he finally did, he sat in the chair in front of his monitor for a long time without moving, and the cold that climbed up his spine was not the cold of fear. It was the colder, older feeling of a soldier realizing the mission has just changed beneath him. The files were old, some of them centuries old, transcribed from leather-bound journals into modern formats by elders who could not let their secrets die. They detailed the war he had walked into, the long blood feud between vampires and Lycans, the assassinations and betrayals, the slow erosion of 2 ancient species into something resembling organized factions. He read it the way he read briefings, parsing for actionable patterns rather than savoring the mythology. But it was the recent files that made his hand still on the keyboard. Within the last decade, certain vampire elders had begun a new project. They had grown impatient with the old war. They had watched humanity develop weapons that could threaten even the immortal. They had decided, in their cold and patient council chambers, that the next stage of evolution would not be left to chance. They had begun harvesting Lycan genetic material. They had begun crossing it with their own. And in the most damning entries of all, they had begun purchasing viral samples through shell corporations from research facilities Chris recognized by name. Facilities he had helped shut down. Facilities whose products had killed his friends. The Underworld was no longer just a war of monsters. It was becoming a laboratory. He read about the early hybrids, the failures, the things that had to be put down before they could leave the holding cells. He read about the breakthroughs, the specimens that had stabilized, the ones that combined vampiric speed with Lycan musculature and resilience, and in the latest entries, a viral aggression vector lifted directly from a strain he had personally helped contain in West Africa. He saw the test subjects. He saw the photographs. He saw what the elders intended to do with them. The plan was not war. The plan was succession. The hybrids were meant to inherit the world the elders had grown tired of ruling from shadows. A new dominant species, engineered rather than evolved, immune to silver, immune to sunlight, immune to the small, stubborn weaknesses that had kept humanity alive for so long. The elders had read history. They had seen what humans did with time. They had decided to replace humans before humans could replace them. Chris closed the files and stood up and walked to the window and looked out over the city. Below him, ordinary people walked under streetlights and umbrellas, ordering coffee, arguing with partners, scrolling through phones, entirely unaware that the species was being quietly auctioned off beneath their feet. He thought of Jill. He thought of Claire. He thought of every soldier he had ever lost to a virus that should never have existed. And he understood with the clarity that only comes once or twice in a lifetime what he was looking at. This was not a vampire problem. This was not a Lycan problem. This was a containment problem. The kind he had been trained for. The kind he had nightmares about. Because if these hybrids escaped the underground network, if even one viable specimen reached a population center, if the viral component cross-contaminated with existing infections in the wider world, the collapse would not look like an outbreak. It would look like an extinction. He sat back down. He pulled out a fresh notebook. He began to plan. He mapped the laboratories the files had named. 6 facilities across Europe, but only one of them, the deepest, the oldest, the one beneath the cathedral district of an unnamed city, contained both the breeding chambers and the master viral stock. The others were satellite. The others could be cleaned up afterward. The center had to go first, and it had to go completely, because anything left intact could be rebuilt within a decade by patient hands that had millennia to wait. He did not contact the BSI. He did not contact any government. He knew exactly how those calls ended. He had seen too many sealed reports, too many quietly funded restart projects, too many men in suits who had looked at a contained sample and seen an opportunity instead of a graveyard. If the hybrids reached official channels, they would not be destroyed. They would be studied. They would be replicated. They would eventually escape. So he chose, as he had chosen many times before, to carry the weight alone. He chose containment. He chose fire. And he began to prepare for the longest night of his career. He moved at the hour the Lycans called the dead time, that brittle gap between 3 and 4 in the morning when even nocturnal predators grew sluggish. The cathedral district above slept under a low ceiling of fog, and the basilica that crowned the hill had not held a real service in decades. Its crypt, however, was very much in use, though not by anyone the church would have recognized. Beneath the crypt, beneath 3 layers of false foundations, beneath a security network that would have made a national bank envious, the laboratory waited. Chris breached from the side, not the front, never the front. He had identified an old maintenance shaft connected to the city's sealed 19th century drainage system, and he had spent 2 nights cutting through forgotten brickwork with thermal lances until the path was open. He came in through a wall the elders had assumed was bedrock, and the first patrol of armed vampires died without ever understanding how they had been outflanked. He carried more weight than any sane man would carry. 2 primary rifles, both modified for silver fragmentation. 6 ultraviolet concussion charges. A satchel of incendiary thermite designed to burn at temperatures that would not allow biological reconstitution. A handheld igniter linked to demolition charges he had placed against load-bearing supports throughout the upper tunnels. He had been working for 9 days, sometimes in the company of distant Lycan howls, sometimes in absolute silence, planting his charges where they would do the most damage in sequence. And he was not alone, though neither he nor she had spoken of it directly. Celine had her own grievances with the elders. She had read enough of the files herself, through her own channels, to understand that the war she had been fighting was a fiction maintained for the convenience of monsters who saw her as a tool. So when she felt the first detonation roll through the bones of the underground, she did not assume she was under attack. She assumed her opponent had finally moved, and she did what she had been preparing to do for weeks. She turned her blades on the council she had served and began carving her way down from the upper levels while he carved his way up from below. They never coordinated. They never had to. The architecture of the assault was so clear, so disciplined, that each of them simply trusted the other to be where they needed to be. The hybrids came in the third corridor. They were worse than the files had suggested. Faster than vampires, stronger than Lycans, their eyes a sick yellow that did not match either lineage, their skin pebbled with the viral keratin Chris had last seen on a creature in a Spanish village he no longer let himself remember. They did not communicate. They did not coordinate. They simply attacked everything that moved, including each other, and Chris recognized the behavior instantly. This was not intelligent predation. This was the chaos of a viral payload still finding its equilibrium. The elders had not yet finished tuning their weapon, and that, more than anything, was why they could still be stopped. He fought through 3 of them in the corridor leading to the breeding chambers. He used the architecture, baiting them into choke points where silver fragmentation could shred their joints, then finishing each with incendiary rounds to the brainstem. He took a strike across the ribs that cracked something he would feel for months. He took a glancing claw across the cheek that would scar in a line just below his eye. He did not slow. He had been here before, in different rooms, in different countries, against different monsters, and the muscle memory carried him forward when willpower might have flinched. The breeding chamber was a cathedral of glass and amniotic fluid. Tanks the size of cars lined the walls, each containing a partially developed hybrid suspended in viscous liquid. Some twitched as he entered. Some opened their eyes. He did not look at them as people, because they were not people, and looking at them as people was a luxury he could not afford. He moved methodically from tank to tank, planting thermite charges at the base of each, his breath steady, his hands sure. Above him, 3 levels up, Celine reached the inner council chamber and ended 6 centuries of vampire politics in roughly 4 minutes. He set the timer. He turned. He ran. The detonation that followed was not a single explosion. It was a cascade, charge after charge cracking through the underground in carefully sequenced waves, collapsing tunnels behind him as he sprinted, sealing chambers, igniting the thermite stores into a chemical fire that reached temperatures the hybrids could not survive. The earth above shook. A crack ran up the foundation of the basilica, and one of its bell towers slumped sideways by a meter and stopped, as if even the building knew not to fall. He came up through the same drainage shaft he had used to enter, covered in ash, bleeding from places he would catalog later, and he stood in the cold pre-dawn air and listened to a war end beneath his feet. The fires burned for 3 days beneath the cathedral district. The official explanation, when one was finally assembled by a city government that did not understand what had actually happened, blamed a ruptured gas main. A handful of historic buildings were quietly condemned. A few streets were closed for renovation. The newspapers ran the story for a week, and then the world moved on, because the world always moved on, because the world had work in the morning and rent at the end of the month, and could not afford to dwell on things that did not directly threaten its routines. But beneath that routine, something had shifted. The vampire covens that had relied on the elders for direction now found themselves leaderless. Without the council, without the bloodline supremacy of the oldest ones, the lesser nobility fractured along regional lines. Some chose isolation, retreating to estates in silence. Some chose negotiation, opening quiet channels with Lycan pacts that had spent centuries as their sworn enemies. Some simply chose to vanish, slipping into new identities in distant cities, hoping the soldier who had walked through their war would not follow. The Lycans, for their part, fared no better. Their breeding pits had been compromised by the same viral experiments that had corrupted the vampires, and the more disciplined of their packs spent the following months hunting their own infected before the contamination could spread. There were no parades. There were no treaties. The ancient war did not end with a signed armistice. It simply emptied itself out, like a wound that has finally stopped bleeding because there is nothing left to bleed. Celine went hunting. Of course she did. She knew, as Chris knew, that the destruction of the central laboratory had not destroyed every sample. Couriers had escaped during the chaos. Field caches had been established years before the assault, hidden in deniable locations across the continent. She left a note for him at one of the dead drops they had silently agreed to use, written in a script he had taught himself to read during the long preparation. She would handle the remnants. He had bought her the time. She would not waste it. He did not write back. There was nothing to say that the work itself did not say. Instead, he sat in another hotel room in another city, and he composed the after-action report he would never send. He wrote it out longhand on cheap paper the way he had been taught in his first year of service. He detailed the threat. He detailed the response. He detailed the casualties, including his own. And then, when it was finished, he read it once, and he burned it in the sink, and he watched the ash circle the drain and disappear. Because he had finally understood something he had been resisting for years. The institutions he had served, the ones that had trained him, that had given him orders and ranks and a flag to fight under, were not built to handle this. They had never been built to handle this. They were built to handle threats they could classify, threats they could file, threats they could eventually monetize through procurement contracts and research grants. Hand them a vampire and they would build a unit. Hand them a Lycan and they would build a weapon. Hand them a hybrid and they would build an industry. He had spent his entire career protecting humanity from monsters created by men who had wanted to be useful. He was not going to hand the next generation of monsters to the next generation of those men. So he chose, for the first time in his life, to keep his mouth shut. He filed a false report citing a failed bioterror lead. He returned his official equipment. He took a leave of absence that everyone assumed he had earned. And then he disappeared, the way men like him sometimes disappear, into a life off the grid, off the books, off the radar of every well-meaning agency that would have welcomed him back. There would be no medal. There would be no record. There would only be the work, continuing in the dark, where it had always been most honest. And in the quiet hours of the morning, in cities he no longer named, he began again. In the years that followed, a story began to spread through the remaining covens, through the scattered Lycan packs, through the few hidden corners of the underworld where memory was still kept the old way. It was told in low voices, in rooms without windows, in languages older than the countries they were spoken in. It was not a story about a vampire. It was not a story about a Lycan. It was not even properly a story about a hero. It was a story about a human who carried silver rounds in unmarked magazines. A human who knew the difference between a fledgling and an elder by the sound of their footsteps. A human who did not believe in their mythology because he had already buried things worse than their mythology. A human who treated the immortal not as gods or demons, but as a containment problem with a finite solution. The young ones did not believe it at first. They asked their elders for details, for a name, for a face. The elders never gave them one. Some claimed he had been killed in a collapse beneath Vienna. Some claimed he had moved on to a different continent and a different war. Some claimed he had never existed at all, and that the legend was simply a parable invented to teach restraint, a warning to never again grow proud, to never again experiment with bloodlines, to never again assume that humanity was prey. But the older ones, the ones who had been there, the ones who had seen the laboratory burn from inside the council chamber, they knew. They did not speak his name because his name had never mattered. They simply remembered the shape of the threat he had represented. A soldier who could not be bought, could not be intimidated, could not be turned. A soldier whose entire moral architecture had been built around the belief that some things must not be allowed to exist. And somewhere, in a city no map would name, in an apartment whose lease was in a name he had never been born with, Chris Redfield cleaned his weapons with the patience of a man who knew the work was not finished. He listened to the rain. He read the news. He noticed the small anomalies, the unexplained disappearances, the corporate filings that did not quite add up, the patterns that ordinary people would never see because ordinary people had been kept, mercifully, ignorant. He poured a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He opened a new notebook. He began again to write, because monsters evolve, and so does he.